Hello, good people, and welcome to the inaugural episode of the HeavenEarth Church Podcast. This is the church in Whiteland, Indiana, which has the mission to make a lasting good impact in our community. My name is Brad Miller, but our guest today is the pastor of HeavenEarth Church, Ross Stackhouse. Ross, welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Brad. I appreciate you doing this for us.
Well, it's an awesome opportunity to share a good word about the mission and ministry of HeavenEarth Church to make a lasting impact in Whiteland and the surrounding community. But I think a good starting point, Ross, for folks who may be checking out HeavenEarth Church and want to learn more about the church and what it's about, is to learn a little bit more about what you and what you're about as the pastor of the church, but moreover as a person who is a child of God and has come into faith, and now find yourself in this leadership position as pastor of this church. But Ross, just tell us a bit about your faith story, about how you came to know Christ in the first place, and maybe a little bit about where you grew up and some of those origins of your faith story.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating. It occurs to me right now as we're sitting here that the church in which I grew up, I realize that it's going through some of its own hard times right now, as all small churches and, kind of rural communities are. And the reason I share that is because it's the tension I've kind of felt my whole life with faith, is that growing up in a church with, 70 people on a Sunday, in a rural community in Shelby County, Indiana, like I can look back and there are things that I'm extremely grateful for, people for whom I'm grateful, who poured in my life. Like my third grade Sunday school teacher who, at the time, you don't realize it when people have really blessed you and helped you, but when you look back, you see like, man, these people, they really made a difference in your life. But I never fit neatly in that church. And that's why I'm saying there's that tension. Like, you hear about it, it struggles, and you're sad, but you also you understand. Like, because that's the story for a lot of my peers, is that it's not that they don't have yearning or desire or hunger for spiritual things. Just being in that organized community just has been a tough proposition, and it was for me my whole life.
So how did that manifest itself in terms of how you lived out your faith, if at all, in those early years? And part of those struggles, how did they come out in school or friends or anything else?
Yeah. So I grew up with I was raised by a single dad. We stay with my mom for the weekend sometimes. My mother struggled with alcoholism, and so the kind of shepherd of our faith was my father, and he's really the reason that, in many ways, that I have the faith that I do. So we were a family who went to church every Sunday. There wasn't like hey, maybe we will, maybe we won't. So I was very fascinated in Jesus from a young age. Like, how did that manifest in me? Like, I would kind of want to, like, dig into it, but it just felt like I'd go to this church community in there, and you be kind of withering, And so how did that manifest later on? By the time I was 14 or 15, I asked my dad, like, can we please go to some other church? And we did, but at 14, I started drinking myself. My sister was too, and I kind of had this, I wouldn't call it duplicitousness, but like I was, partying, getting rowdy, but also I read the Bible like all the time, and I was more and more intrigued with Jesus. I just felt like this electricity with his life, but I would not experience that same electricity in the church, and I would not feel it around other Christians. And that right there was where I resonate with so many people who, like, they try Christian community or they've been in Christian community and they just have this great sense of disillusionment.
Something just didn't work or click for them, and so you found yourself kind of on your own solo path, as it were,
Yeah.
to try to figure things out. And so, in trying that process of figuring things out, what kind of pathways did you find yourself coming up with? What kind of solutions or answers did you start coming up with?
I mean, some of it was in the church. Like, so we went to a non-denominational community church around here, and it was part of what we now call like the church growth, like seeker-sensitive movement. Mm-hmm. So it was more just like earthy conversations, very practical messages, what people might call the rock band show on Sundays. But at that age for me, 15, 16, it was helpful because there were things that I could relate to. So that was helpful, but the itch it wasn't scratching was that there still was not this, like, when I'd read about Jesus, I'd read about his teachings, his life. There was this dynamism. And so eventually, like I said, I would read that Bible. I'd read a study Bible. It was an NIV study Bible. It was the first one I read cover to cover. I had this hunger to understand. Meanwhile, I was in a band with some friends, and they grew up in a non-denominational Christian church, and I was watching some of those friends lose their faith. And I was looking at my other peers around me. I was in all these other spaces, non-denominational Christian church, Southern Baptist Bible studies, and all of them just like left you wanting. And some of them were just like, this just doesn't feel right. So then I eventually, to fast forward a little bit, I went to Purdue University. There's a couple of those guys from the band. I was going to go there anyways. I watched them further lose their faith, like once and for all. Like they were done. I started out in pre-med, but eventually switched over to something you should never do at Purdue. I did religious studies, and I wanted to study the historical person of Jesus. And that was the first time, like, I really started to scratch that itch of, like, I really want to know about his life through and through. I want to understand. I want to see it. So,
well, you haven't in your education, correct? You said, something you should never do at Purdue was go to religious studies. Was there something about that kind of another corporate experience, like you kind of had the corporate experience in the local church? Mm-hmm. Was there something about that was either enhancing or disillusioning as well in that type of setting?
No, it was enhancing. One, I started going to a church there that I had never experienced anything like it. It was Purdue Christian Campus House, and the thing that I'd never experienced was this vulnerability. It was a community of authenticity. It was a community of depth and authenticity, seriousness and grace. Like, I remember seeing people on a Sunday morning that I'd seen at the bar the night before. But it wasn't like surface level conversation to kind of like sidestep that. It was like really getting to the blood and guts of being human and trying to be a follower of Jesus. And that was like, that was
really resonate with you.
That was a game changer. I had not experienced that in the church in which I grew up. That was just very institutional, traditional, put you to sleep kind of stuff, to be honest. And then the other side of the coin was that non-denominational kind of Christian community that was very practical and quote unquote relevant, but like the substance, not deep at all. And that would just leave you wanting. So when I got to Purdue, I had Purdue Christian Campus House, but I also I did an independent study with a theologian in residence there from Notre Dame. And it was all about just the historical Jesus, the quest for the historical Jesus, which, if folks don't know, was really something that started in the early 20th century by a guy named Albert Schweitzer. people just wanted to study Jesus like you'd study other historical figures.
Right.
And I didn't know any of that sort of thing was out there. I didn't know that there was this kind of intellectual pursuit of Jesus, which at that time I was really yearning for and found that, or at least found the beginning of it there.
Sure. What's something that struck you that was kind of an aha moment about that early studies about the historical Jesus, that kind of think, okay, this is profoundly impactful and different than what I had experienced, both on kind of the traditional church and the other church experiences that you had?
Yeah, so if I were to just take a cross section of some my experiences of Jesus in my childhood, teenage years, in that mainline Christianity United Methodist Church, Jesus was kind of boring. Like, just to put it like kind of
Sure.
bluntly, like,
And therefore, church was often boring.
yeah,
too.
like
Right.
it was like, okay, here are the lectionary readings for the day. Here's the church season we're in, which can be ritual can be so sacred and holy and sacramental, but it just didn't come across that way. And then you go to the non-denominational world, the Christian community church, like Jesus is cool.
Mm-hmm.
But somehow that also missed like the edge and seriousness of Jesus. Like the church was edgy and it somehow took out the edge of Jesus. Mm. And then I would be like I went to church camp in the non-instrumental Church of Christ. There, Jesus was almost like a fundamentalist tyrant who was like out to get people. Similarly, in the Southern Baptist Bible study, like that was all about, like Jesus actually had very little voice in those settings. That was more about like Paul's rules. That was really more of rules of the Apostle Paul movement. Mm-hmm. Here are the do's and don'ts, and here's what it means to be a Christian. When I got to Purdue, I experienced in that church the vulnerability, the compassion, the love, but also the seriousness of Jesus, like how this life that he is inviting us to is radically transforming. And then I also experienced in the sort of the world of scholarship, like how almost a sense of relief, like, oh man, we haven't remotely captured Jesus yet. Like he transcends all these pictures. Like he's still way out there, untamed, yet to be discovered.
So you were learning that Jesus is radically transforming. Anywhere along this time were you personally radically transformed?
Not yet.
Okay.
But if we were to go to kind of our background, you and me, Brad, which I didn't even really care about at the time, ironically. I learned about it in confirmation, in United Methodist confirmation classes. But in the founder of the Methodist movement is John Wesley, and for folks who don't know, and a lot of his way of understanding Jesus's transforming love is through what we call grace. And he has this one concept called prevenient grace, where like God is stirring something in you before you've really fully turned toward God's light, towards Jesus and towards a transformative life with him. Looking back, I can see in my 19, 20, 21, like there was something stirring, like the waters were heating up to get to a boil. So like that was happening in that Purdue Christian campus life, community. I was diving in there, like they had bought this property in the heart of campus and were turning into a coffee house. And so I dove in there and helped, lay a floor there. And but also in reading these different scholarly perspectives, I was seeing like this robust Jesus that for whom I was searching. I didn't figure out to me who he was yet, But I had realized, like, okay, these depictions of him don't.
So you get an image, a
get there.
vision of what you wanted and you sought, but it wasn't quite there yet. So let's there had to be, for every person I know who went into ministry in some form or another, there was some kind of a tipping point.
Yeah.
Call it a calling, call it what you will, but some sort of a transformation point. Say, okay, I need to look a little more deeply in this and how to make this possibly, what I want to do with my life. And so let's begin to go to that place, this point of call or movement that way.
Yeah. So as I realized that I ended up majoring in creative writing and religious studies at Purdue. Wrote poetry, which is a nice world for me. Helps you to look at the world with wonder, which I was again missing in the church. The world had not equipped me with this lens for looking at the world with wonder, enjoyment, gratitude, generosity, things like that. But I realized I wanted to spend my life investigating, exploring Jesus, the person of Jesus, the movement he founded. And at that time, I decided that I wanted to go to get a master's degree and then eventually a PhD to teach some discipline related to that, be it ancient Near East history, biblical studies, and at an academic level, whatever. So I ended up at Vanderbilt Divinity School. I just went there to go to school. I wasn't going there to be a pastor. I didn't really honestly research it that much. I was like, okay, here are some options for places to which you can apply to get a Master of Theological Studies, and it seems like there's some good people there. I had no idea what that meant, and so they gave me some decent money, so I went there. I had no idea what I was doing. Because the reason I say that was when I got there, my pursuit was ego-driven. I'd seen all these people fall out of faith. I'd started to think like, man, it's because they don't really they don't know, and the church doesn't know. I'm gonna figure out what the New Testament and the Bible really means. I'm gonna tell people.
So this became a much more of an academic pursuit, or kind of a discerning kind of a deal, rather than maybe a spiritual transformation. Is more of a intellectual enlightenment sort of a thing. Yeah.
I thought I was gonna. There was a beginning of a calling. Mm-hmm. I thought it was kind of noble, altruistic. I'm gonna go find Jesus for people and then show people. What I didn't know is that I didn't know Jesus yet. I started to know Jesus intellectually in a different way and spiritually, no doubt about it. I was having some spiritually transformative moments at Purdue, no doubt. So I jumped in at Vanderbilt, and a lot of different things happened. Like you're saying, I've witnessed to some people too. It's not the same, but there's a general arc before you have this explosive transformational moment. For a lot of people, before that happens, you have some great disruption. Where things kind of fall apart, a disorientation. And so I was jumping in at doing biblical studies. Again, no pastoral classes, doing a lot of history and studying Greek, stuff like that. But first of all, a lot of people at Vanderbilt Divinity School were super progressive. I'd grown up mostly around the super conservative people. And so this had nothing to do with my studies. It was about the people who were saying, we consider ourselves Christians, but I was like, oh my God, they're saying, you can't say those things. You're thinking it and you're saying that? You can't do that. So that was an initial disruption. What? This is out there? So at first I was offended, unsettled, and for a minute it was like, okay, now I really got to double down on figuring out who Jesus is so I can tell these people too, because they're wrong.
Yeah. How'd that work out?
Not good. I also at that time, I started working for, sounds bizarre, for an Orthodox Jewish family. I worked for, this family ran Vanderbilt's Chabad Jewish Center. And so that meant that I needed to make some money. And so I would get food and cook Sabbath for the students in this community every week.
All right.
So I was right in the center of life for an Orthodox Jewish family every week.
So you were the Gentile employee to help them
Correct.
get through the Sabbath day.
Correct.
Okay.
Someone who was Jewish told me I was the Shabbos Goyim. I don't know if that's correct.
I'm not familiar with that term. But that's all right. But,
I
but congratulations.
have no idea if that's true, but that's what they said I was.
Congratulations, yeah.
But even that too was a good disruption because I realized looking back, I was not at all in touch with the Jewishness of Jesus, which the church had never equipped me with that perspective, and it's such a rich perspective. Mm-hmm. Jesus was 24/7 a Jewish person.
Sure.
And that was
So this time, if I'm understanding then, Ross, you're having a little exposure, at least through Judaism, through actual living with Jewish folks. Or working with them, very in the middle of it, not just kind of an academic pursuit, but you were there, and also being exposed to different ways of viewing Christianity, a progressive approach, conservative approach, and so this had to be kind of an eye-opening and not only disruptive for you, but sounds to me it was a part of a reformation of your faith journey. So go with that for a minute. How you had to tear things apart and then you had to put them back together.
Yeah. So also at Purdue, one of my closest friends was Muslim. We went on spring break together, and so that was in there too. That he was is such a beautiful person, and so I was just, like you said, I was just getting all these perspectives that were so rich and diverse. And my mentor in New Testament studies was a Jewish woman, Amy Jill Levine, who wrote my recommendations and things like that. Learned so much from her. So I continued along that path of pursuing the master's in theological studies with a focus in New Testament there. Did pretty well. Was on the path. I applied to 6 PhD programs because I was going to go on to teach and write, things like that. And then the final disruption happened. Already at this time, I should say that by the grace of God, I wasn't just repelling these perspectives of the progressive folks with whom I was in community. I started to ask myself, well, is there any truth represented in what they're saying? And I started to think, yeah, there is. There were parts of what Jesus had said that they were pointing to that folks obviously, to go back to my high school years, that non-denominational Christian church, they weren't getting into the meat of Jesus anyways. It was all very surface level, seeker sensitive stuff.
Right.
Great for starting out, but it won't get you very deep in your faith. But certainly in the Southern Baptist circle, non-instrumental Church of Christ, these were perspectives of Jesus you would have thought they weren't even in the Bible. Mm-hmm. And even in the Methodist church, like I said, it's just boring. It wasn't exciting stuff. And those perspectives were about justice. These parts where Jesus says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He's anointed me to preach good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind, release to the captives, and to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That's in there. He announces that, that's why
Sure.
I've come.
Yeah.
I have come to set
But that
wrong
was not a part of your understanding, your experience, and certainly didn't resonate with what you understood Christianity to be about.
Not at all. And so I was getting super stretched. I remember being in an ancient Near East literature class, like reading about all these other ancient religions that are around. So I'm just getting stretched in a beautiful way, because it made me have to like kind of go through a refinement process. Like, hey man, what do you believe? Well, then the last disruption, or the great disruption, happened. I applied to 6 PhD programs, got one letter back that said, hey, thanks, but no thanks. Then a second, then a third, then a fourth, fifth, sixth. The thing I'd been working towards was over. It was done. I then went into, I had a massive mental breakdown in my first year of marriage. I'd gone in Vanderbilt. I moved down there in 2009, got married in 2010, then my wife moved down there with me. And in our first year of marriage, I had this massive mental breakdown. I was having 3, 4, 5 panic attacks a day. I didn't even like believe in depression. I looked at these billboards that had like were in black and white, and people looked depressed, but like, how weak are these people?
Sure.
And so my ego experienced like a final just wrecking ball.
Yeah. So how you were married, you were starting off, you had this major devastating experience of 6, not just 1 or 2, but 6 rejection letters.
Yeah.
Rejection in and of itself is a hard thing to take in anyway, but if you had your life do this way, and then so how did you cope in that period of time? You said you're having these anxiety attacks multiple times a day. How did you even cope during this time, and what was a point of light that got you out of it?
At first, I didn't cope. I literally thought I was dying, because I didn't know what depression was like. I'd never had any of this. I never had a panic attack. So most days I just walked around like a zombie, and I had to still finish school. I remember at one period I had over like 90 pages of writing due in a 2-week span. And so I had to show up and still do the work.
Yeah.
I had to still be married. So in the midst of this like ego death, as I've heard people say, I started searching the scriptures not for intellectual understanding, but because I felt like I was dying. And so I was spending every morning in the Gospel of John. And I was sitting in my car in a parking lot spot at Madison Ridge Lake Apartments in Nashville. And I was just weeping, depressed. It was a beautiful day outside, but my psyche didn't experience it. It was a terrible day. And I was sitting there, and spiritual awakenings are tough to recount, because you know that people are like, well, that was a voice you cooked up in your head. That's fine that anyone can believe that. I know what I experienced.
Sure, but this is your story.
I experienced the person of Jesus saying very gently, quietly from John 15, like, I am the vine, you're the branch, Ross. Apart from me, you can do nothing. And in that moment, I knew for me that meant like I had spent much of my time with like kind of 1 foot in the vine, Jesus, and 1 foot kind of in this worldly pursuit. I wanted to be committed to Jesus, this person that I was convinced increasingly was it, like was who he says he, or is who he says he was. And but I was also kind of all in with this worldly pursuit of like being a scholar and someone who shows up on the National Geographic specials. And
yeah, well, when you put your name in to be a PhD student, you want to get that PhD.
Oh yeah,
and do something profound with it. That's the way many people are. And so now you had this moment in the car. You had this literally kind of a come to Jesus moment. Did anything change then, or what happened?
Everything changed.
Okay.
I knew what that voice was saying to me. It was saying you can't have 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And it wasn't like an ultimatum like I experienced in this like Southern Baptist world, or the evangelical world. It wasn't like that at all. It was just an invitation. It was Jesus saying, I'm showing you reality right now. What you do with that reality doesn't change the reality. It just changes your relationship with the reality. Mm-hmm. And so I knew there was no other way but like, I'm all in. And I didn't feel better yet, physically, psychologically, but spiritually, I had a clarity that I've had ever since. I knew what my life was for.
So you have clarity and you have direction now, and all in. I've heard you say some form of that a couple of times. You
Mm-hmm.
need to be 1 foot over here, and
Mm-hmm.
your academic pursuits in 1 foot, and for lack of a better term, life of faith. So how did that eventually lead you to whatever you did to complete a calling, in a sense, that led you into a pastoral ministry? I mean, it seemed like this was a pivotal moment. You run this academic track,
Yeah.
and somehow you ended up in pastoral ministry.
Yeah.
So take us on that journey a little bit.
So I finished at Vanderbilt.
So you ended up with the Master of Theological Studies.
Yep, with concentration in New Testament studies. So incredibly grateful for that experience. That was life-changing. But then my wife and I moved back home to Indiana because she was going to go to law school. And so she went to IU in Indianapolis. And initially, I didn't know at all what to do with this. I experienced it as a calling, what happened in that car. And I knew I was all in the vine. But I think I want to share this with everybody as long as I got breath. Like, these wilderness experiences that you read about in the Bible, how, Jesus himself went out in the wilderness for 40 days and then launched his ministry. I was doing that. I didn't know at all I went back home, and I didn't have anything to do. And so I went back. I had worked with a contractor, worked for a painting company. So I started like a small little business to pay the bills. And I was doing that for a year.
So you're doing manual labor jobs, painting and whatnot during that time. Okay. And
Yeah.
While Angel was going to law school.
While
right?
she was going to law school.
Okay.
And at that time, I started to explore, somewhere in there, started thinking about therapy, working through, because part of the puzzle was that I realized that I had...
Just be clear, when you start thinking about therapy, about having therapy or being a therapist?
No, going to therapy for myself. It started to click for me somewhere along there. Like, nobody likes failure. Nobody likes rejection. But I experienced it much more intensely because with some of my childhood trauma, you asked how'd you cope? I had used achievement to cope all these years. Because if you get A's and you get trophies, everyone likes you.
Yeah.
Well, for once, I didn't get the A, I didn't get the trophy, I got rejection. Sure. And so I didn't know who I was then.
And especially if you'd had more or less a history of success, then more even were devastating when you were crushed.
I'd never not succeeded. Mm-hmm. And like you said, I didn't just get like 1, I got 6, saying you're out. But that tilled the soil of my soul to understand Jesus, and that's what's hard, is that Jesus makes more sense when you're really weak.
Yeah.
So I did that for a year, went back, and then I needed a job. I was looking for jobs. I didn't even know what you do. What do you do with this? It's like a parent's worst fear. It's like, well, what are you going to do with these degrees, son? So my sister, who is United Methodist ordained pastor, sent my resume around to some people. And there's a church in Carmel, Indiana, St. Mark's, who gave me a call because it's a pretty large congregation for our churches, 450 people on a Sunday, something like that. But they were experiencing what a lot of churches were experiencing, in that they may have had 450 people, but the amount of like people under the age of 40, 45 was a very small percentage, and that was becoming increasingly the case. So they wanted to start a new contemporary worship service. They were searching for a part-time person for that. So they gave me a call, and at first I was not interested at all. But then the pastor at the time, Bill Keith, was just, I just remember him being somewhat persistent. Like, well, hey, would you want to come and talk to us? And so I went, and I said, well, okay, what do I have to lose? I don't care.
Yeah.
This sounds...
If I'm understanding, you still kind of needed a job at the time, right?
Yeah. I wasn't going to a Methodist church. In Nashville, we went to an Anglican church.
Okay. Wow.
Which I loved that. I talked, like, it's funny how I like went full circle back to more sacramental, liturgical, ritualistic church, but I didn't experience it as boring or sleepy at all. It was vibrant. So anyways, I showed up to this interview with Bill Keith and Susanna Helms, and they start talking about their vision, and they'd been searching for someone for 2 years. So it was ironic that, like, I got these 6 rejection letters, but for them, it's like, hey, we think we found our guy. All these other places were like, that is not the guy. This church was like this.
Yeah. So you had a little affirmation of being wanted. Right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
And they laid out their vision. And since I had nothing to lose, there was no ego pursuit. I just said very, like, authentically, I was like, well, for what it's worth, it sounds to me like you're trying to, like, you need to change the whole culture of your church, because younger generations aren't going to be a part of your community because of something you do for an hour on a Sunday. Like, you're going to have to do something culturally throughout your whole church. And for me, like, you're going to hire honestly, probably 2 full-time people for this, like, culture shift. And then, much to my surprise, they called me back and said, sounds great.
You're the guy. Yeah?
Do you want to do it? And
so what went through your mind at that time? Was that a lump in the throat time? Was that a sinking feeling? Was that a exhilarated feeling? Was that a relief to have a job kind of thing? What was going through your mind then?
It was biblical. Like, you realize that, like, some of these stories in the Bible, they're not as far-fetched as they seem. They're actually incredibly human. So, like, all these stories from cover to cover of people being shocked that they're getting called to do this thing they never dreamed they'd be doing, but then in doing it, they find out, like, what they're really about, what their life is for. So the last part of this interview process was, they said, well, if you're the person, it turns out that, part of your job will be starting this new Sunday gathering, and you'll be the guy to preach at it or have a message every Sunday. Have you ever done that? No, of course not. I've not done any of that. And they said, well, how about we have an audition service? We'll get as many of our folks to show up as we can, and that'll be like an audition sermon for you. That was in January of 2012. I preached on John 15, and I literally had 2 ladders up on stage with me at the encouragement of my friend Nathan Couch, because I was telling him about this. He was like, dude, you should put 2 ladders up there with you, 2 step ladders. And I shared, like, what I'm doing here. And I said, like, I was trying to climb 2 ladders at once. But the higher I got to the top, like, the more I was stretched between the 2 of them. And then eventually you can't touch on both anymore. And the best thing that happened to me is that I fell down. And I chose.
You can't do the splits forever.
No, you can't. And then in falling, I realized that those ladders, that whole ladder system didn't even exist. Like, Jesus is not a ladder system. He's a vine system.
Interesting, yeah.
And so I knew that day. I had an electricity running through me I'd never had in my life. That electricity I saw in the person of Jesus when I was a boy who would drink on the weekends and read his Bible through the week, I felt it. Like, I felt that invigoration of the Holy Spirit, like fully alive, like this is what I'm meant to do. And even my wife, who when she married me, as we were getting married, said, hey, you can go do this like Vanderbilt thing, whatever, but I'm not going to be a pastor's wife. She grew up Baptist. She did not want to do the preacher's wife gig. And even she, after that, was like,
Okay.
this is it.
So if I'm understanding, you had your spiritual awakening in the parking lot there in Nashville. And now you've begun to have a bit of a calling, as it
Yeah.
were, the term we often use in pastoral circles, calling.
Mm-hmm.
And you had an affirmation from Carmel St. Mark's Church. And then you got to work, right?
Yep.
You got to work. And so tell me just a little bit about that and how that eventually led you to another calling to come to HeavenEarth.
Yeah, so I got hired with one of my best friends, Justin Vance. We launched this initiative called Emerging Ministries. Like, that was kind of the cultural shift that we were trying to make. And our whole existence was about kind of meeting next generations where they were, where they are, but also people who are maybe in what we call like that de-churched, unchurched category, and really trying to build a community with those folks in mind. And it was a beautiful thing to be a part of. We spent 6 years there, my wife and I did, and she was working on law school, and we lived with her at the time, 90-some-year-old grandfather. That was another education. But we watched as that community formed and grew. We watched ourselves being stretched. We had amazing staff people who like bought into it and supported a couple of 25-year-old kids. I'll never forget my first week there. I sat in this office like waiting for like an orientation, and then I realized it wasn't coming. It was just like,
Go get him, kid.
it was like, go,
Yeah.
hey, go for it. And that church had experienced what I had experienced personally. They had tried a worship service before. That had, was okay, but they had to shut it down. It didn't work.
Some sort of a contemporary style
Yeah.
worship or something like that.
So
Okay.
we had both failed in a sense and then came together for this like sort of rebirth. And we started something called The Current, which was a gathering in the middle of the two Sunday morning traditional services. We ended up launching a discipleship pathway, or a pathway for people who were, entering through that. And it was extremely fruitful. And again, I started to see like, this is what I'm born to do. And I started to feel that I was feeling that invigoration of like helping people who were maybe like me. It's not like they were just completely turned off to the person of Jesus, but like institutional religion just didn't work. So
Well, tell me a story about a person or situation there that was pivotal in affirming that. Did you say, okay, here's a person who really was in a place that was, kind of stuck or not good or whatever, but now as a result of the ministry that you were part of, some transformation took place there?
oh my gosh, there's so many of them. Well, there's a family I think of. The mom had never, at the time, I think she was in her 50s, and she did not grow up in church. Her friends went to church, and she recounts that she watched her friends on certain seasons and such, or when church would come around, like they weren't available to play or whatever, and her family system was not a part of that. But there was somebody at our church who invited her to come, and I'm so thankful that person took that risk. at the end of the day, an invitation is still where it's at.
Sure.
You know, this person had the relationship in place, and the woman I'm talking about trusted this person, like, hey, if they're inviting me to this thing, it must be worth at least checking out. So she started coming. And I would get emails from her, messages where she talked about her background and her struggle with this stuff. And then her kids started coming, who were maybe late teens, early 20s at the time. And her husband too. And her husband grew up Catholic. And then fast forward, father had been baptized, but the mom and two kids hadn't. They got baptized. It was like a story from Acts 16, like the whole household. And today, they are some of the, like, they bless me. And it just so happens that they are a part of this church now.
Oh, okay. Awesome. Well, that brings us around to beginning to shift our conversation a little bit of how you came here. But I would like for you to, if you don't mind, Ross, to kind of share for just a second before we kind of move eventually into the origin story of HeavenEarth Church. Speak to that person who may be listening to your voice here today or seeing this video and who's kind of going through some similar faith upheaval struggles. They've had their share of disruption, whatever it is, and looking for some way. What are some parts about your coming to faith story and everything you shared here today that may be helpful to that person who's had their own journey that's with lots of disruptions?
That's such a great question. I want to do it justice. I never dreamed that Jesus could be as vibrant, life-giving, real as I now know him to be. When I was looking at his life from the vantage point of my religious experience when I was 12, or at the church camp where I experienced religious trauma, that it was a non-instrumental Church of Christ church camp where I was made to feel like a pariah, or in the Southern Baptist Bible study. Not all Southern Baptists are bad, but this is my experience. When I was looking at Jesus, or even from a relatively good experience at the non-denominational community church I went to, when I was looking at Jesus from those vantage points, that was my reality. And it wasn't hopeless, but it also wasn't hopeful. And it sometimes actually did feel hopeless.
Okay.
I never dreamed that Jesus could be as vibrant, as life-changing, as real as I now know him to be. He is yet untamed by organized religion. He is like a good lion who won't be caged. And I keep learning more and more and more and more of that. So I would say to people, I'm sorry for what you've been through and what you're going through. I don't know your experience. I don't know how hopeless it has become or how hopeless it could feel right now. And maybe you've been through religious circles that you're there too. The vantage point from which you're looking at Jesus is just not encouraging. But I do offer you this invitation to consider that Jesus is yet more vibrant, more life-changing, more real than you could imagine. And there is a different vantage point from which you can see him. You just may not be there yet.
Mm. And that different vantage point, in my mind, at least from our conversation, became a little bit of the seed, if you will, of what eventually led to starting HeavenEarth Church.